Welcome everybody. I'm Melissa Graham-Meeks and I'm the Director of Professional Development for Eli Review, which means I help instructors do all the things: course design, troubleshooting, research, and other things that come up. So I help people get things done. Eli, for those of you who don't know, is a course tool designed by instructors at Michigan State University. So Bill Hart-Davidson and Jeff Grable and Mike McLeod built Eli for the purpose of helping instructors teach effective peer feedback and critical thinking. If you've not seen the system, it's just a scaffold for the writing process. Students turn in a little piece of writing or a long piece of writing, but just something to share. Then they give each other feedback using questions that you've designed. That produces some data that you can use and that they can use. And the big idea is that they'll use that feedback to plan a revision. So we're trying to help them improve their reflective thinking. And the idea is that you'll do it as often as possible. On our team, we really emphasize the notion of giver's gain, which are the benefits of giving helpful feedback. But we all know that giving feedback is quite hard. And so the important thing is for the instructions you give to help all students have a good conversation about the criteria of the assignment. So the showcase is to highlight what's happening in different disciplines. And today I'm so happy to welcome from the University of Arizona both Catrina Mitchum and Shelley Rodrigo, and they'll be presenting first, and then Brian Gogan from Western Michigan University. And the way this will happen is Catrina's going to share her review task first, and then Brian will share, and at the end we'll have questions. Please use the chat as we go. So Catrina, I've stopped the share so that you can share, and I'll ask you to start just by giving us a little context about your program and the course, and then the writing task that precedes this review.
Okay, I forgot to unmute myself before all of my controls went away. Okay, so we at the University of Arizona, our writing program serves, well, this year serves around 5,500 students or so. We started using Eli Review in just our traditional asynchronous online classes about 2 years ago. This particular review that I'm sharing is from our 102 class. So this is our second course in our series of freshman writing at the university. So the next question was, what is the project, right?
Yeah, what's the writing task?
Okay, so when we first started using Eli, we were designing the classes for 7.5-week classes. So we also wanted students to be able to do as many review cycles as possible so that we were using it frequently, which meant that we took a look at what our projects were and how we may break them down into smaller bits for students. And that was really, really useful for this particular project. So this is a small piece of an annotated bibliography. So we broke it down into, just doing a few sources and doing the sort of the build for a few sources before they had to do the complete draft. So this particular review is looking at an assignment that their classmates have turned in that has 4 citations in APA and then includes 4 summaries. And in the summaries, they have had, so in the writing task, they were given sort of a template for the rhetorical précis. And that's what they should be including in their, in the writing task that's being reviewed here.
Great, thank you. Now can you walk us through the review task and tell us about how you design those questions to guide your weakest students and your strongest students in giving feedback?
Sure. So we relied pretty heavily on trait identifications and divided it into the 2, sort of elements that we asked for in the writing task. And in our trait identifications, we pulled very heavily from the rubric that students were going to be graded on for the final annotated bibliography. So we pulled those in as our trait identifications. So you can see that the first one is on APA citations, and then the second one is on the summaries. So as the students are going through, they're just, clicking to see if, if those pieces are sort of there. And then we used the contextual comments element to prompt students, we hope, to pull in the criteria that they have checked off or not checked off. And we ask them to use describe, evaluate, suggest as their format when they're describing the criteria that they saw or didn't see, their evaluation of whether or not that criteria was met, and then their suggestion for how they can meet that missing criteria. And then we have that for both of those areas. So for the citations, but then also for the summaries. And then lastly, we have a final overall comment, which we have since decided we're tossing moving forward. But that's how we have sort of built the review.
Can you say more about that decision to toss the final comment?
Yeah, so we got a whole bunch of data from Melissa at the end of spring, beginning of summer, and we have been analyzing it. So we are looking at sort of the response length that falls between 20 words and 40 words. And as we've been analyzing, it's like 4,000 some odd reviews, one of the things that has jumped out to us is that students with, when they're following these contextual comments and they're specifically going and looking at the criteria and pulling things in, are actually giving pretty good reviews. Like to us, they're showing that they are reading and understanding what they need to do. And then the final comments are sort of where we fall back into that, great job, I really liked it. So we started getting, we started getting back into the types of reviews that we're trying to move away from. So to us, that felt like, well, this is useless. So let's just cut it for now, or start using something else we've talked about a little bit, is starting to use some sentence starters in those final comments to sort of guide students into, what exactly an overall comment might pull in.
The other thing that was happening, and again, just reminder that the analysis we're focusing on is reviews that were 20 to 40 words. So there may be longer ones, but especially with those shorter ones, we were seeing things where someone who said, as I said above. So it wasn't, the comment kind of by itself wasn't doing any work because they had already done some really heavy, productive, precise lifting above.
That's great. So the last question before we shift to Brian is, how do you know this review is working? You've already kind of given away that I can pull data for you across all of your sections in about 4 hours. But what else would you say lets you know this review and this practice is working for your students, whatever working means to you?
So I guess we've already touched on the data, so I'll go anecdotally. So anecdotally, I have noticed that, because I've taught the annotated bibliography up to a million times before, and I've noticed that when students are getting to the point where, we ask them to do 4 here, and then they have to do another 4 for the draft. And when they are doing those other 4 for the draft, they are much more thorough than they have been in the past. So anecdotally, to me, that means that they're learning something about annotated bibliographies from doing this particular review, because their citations are spot on. I get a lot fewer questions about about citations, and then their rhetorical crises are pretty thorough. So I think that's a good sign, in addition to all of those reviews that we looked at that were pretty positive. We weren't in the 20 to 40 word range, as Melissa likes to call the messy middle. We weren't sure what we were going to find, but we are finding that students are, really focusing on what we're asking them to look for, and giving feedback that's useful.
And just one clarification, the messy middle is because describe, evaluate, suggest takes about 40 words. if it's shorter than 20, we pretty much know it's grammar or praise, but in the messy middle, like Catrina was saying, it might be describe, evaluate, suggest, but probably not. So that's why they were focusing their research in that area. Shelley, anything to add about how you know this is working?
I'm just going to, at this point, as the administrator, add anecdotally that, you know, faculty who are happier both with the peer review process, that, you know, that they feel like that the students are, it's more productive for the students, and also happier with the final resulting products. And so that is always a win-win. And I mean, especially because we have definitely people external. So when we first did this, the very first time we did this, we actually did it with faculty in other disciplines, external to writing studies, but even internal to writing studies who, you know, peer review is a lot of work. To do it well is a lot of work, and they don't want to do it. And so to have faculty, including GATs, who are either less prepared and or, you know, strapped for time, all kind of agree. I remember the first semester after we implemented this, they were really happy with it. We were pleasantly surprised with how happy they were with it. So not necessarily, I'm not necessarily speaking to this one, but just kind of overall. But just to share our overall kind of process, they look a lot like this, where it's very heavy on trade identification, and then the contextual comments is asking for comments to follow up that move.
Great, thank you. So
I'm
Brian, yeah, so Brian, would you mind sharing your screen and then just talking to us a little bit about your course and then the writing task that precedes the review you're going to share?
Sure. All right. You should be seeing the screen right now, correct? All
Yes.
right, it's coming through. First of all, thank you, Melissa, and also Catrina and Shelley for this conversation today. You know, it's nice to have the opportunity to discuss Eli Review and also peer review, peer feedback. We really know that it's valuable to student writers, so thanks. Western was an early adapter. Western Michigan University, where I direct the writing program, was an early adapter of Eli Review. I believe it was 2014, and that was before I was directing the writing program. And since that time, there's been some significant changes in our program, and the big one is that we have a new general education curriculum. So there have been some major recent changes to our first-year writing course, which is now called Foundations in Written Communication. It's a course that serves roughly 2,000 students each year. It's about 70% of our first-year class. And it essentially has two major project sequences right now. One of them focuses on success messaging and students, basically student success and how students relate to those success messages. That's the first course project assignment sequence. And then the second course project assignment sequence focuses on equity and equality, power, privilege, and policy. So that's the longer of the two sequences. It's probably a little bit more of the traditional sequence if we think of a first-year writing course as well. So the task that you see right here is a writing task, and it shows up at the end of that success-focused arc, if you will, that first sequence. And what we ask students to do here is to write essentially a short research memo, a 2-page research memo, where they have had to interview somebody that they would describe as a success mentor, and then they put kind of that individual's definition of success into conversation with their own personal definition of success. One of the outcomes that this assignment meets is an information literacy outcome. So if you're familiar with kind of the framework from the, I'm going to mess up the acronym, but the Research Library, American Council of Research Library framework, one of the threshold concepts is scholarship as a conversation, of course, very familiar to us in rhetoric and writing studies. So this is kind of where that assignment comes in. And you can see what I'm showing right now is actually our course clone. Eli Review, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with this feature in Eli Review, but from a programmatic standpoint, you can set up an Eli Review framework and then copy it to multiple sections of courses. And it's something that we've been using for 2 years now. We found it useful. We allow instructors to kind of adapt it, riff off of it as needed, but it helps us start from a similar place. And in our case, we do use Eli review frequently. So we have about one write and review task, varying lengths, about a week. So we have about 15 or 16 of them in the arc of the course, which, we're playing around with that number. But this one comes early on. Like I said, it's, as you see, number 5. Okay. Does that give pretty good context? Other questions?
Yeah. Can you walk us through the review?
Sure. Let me just switch the tab here. Is that large enough for everybody to see? Okay. So this review task, you can see a little bit more detailed. In both of these tasks, we're doing a couple of things. As Catrina and Shelley mentioned, we're referencing the assignment criteria, which is really important because it's, again, developing a sensitivity to the assignment, but also something that the students can then take and kind of use in their own writing, right? If they're responding to a peer on 5 criteria for the peers assignment, hopefully there's some meta awareness being generated, some kind of internalization of those criteria that will support the students' writing when they go back into their own writing, right? As the reviewer, when they go back into their own writing to make some changes. So we're referencing, we're reinforcing those assignment criteria. Also, our custom textbook. So you can see we are, I don't know if the highlighting is showing up, but we're actually flagging specific sections of the textbook. This reinforces reading practices as well. We have a lot of students that probably would choose not to read the textbook, but when we say, hey, go back to this section, look at it, and that's kind of the prompt, part of the prompt, it helps the students, again, reinforce the reading, but also the curricular content. And this is all tied back into the instruction that's occurring this year, fully synchronously in remote settings, but it would happen in the instruction in the classroom as well. So we're reinforcing, we're connecting, we are emphasizing the assessment criteria, the curriculum, essentially the strategies that we want students to take away from this course.
Great. So Brian, how do you know this one's working, or this review, or the whole like weekly Eli review thing? How do you know it's working?
The one thing that I neglected to mention, for instance, with this review task, you can see that we focus on contextual comments as well as final comments. Okay, so we do, in some of our review sequences, we do use trait identification, the Likert items, but primarily we've directed our attention to contextual comments and final comments. And the way we are framing and prompting students to write is numbers of comments. And this leads into the answer to your question. How do we know this is working? We have been really interested in the practice component here. We look at Eli Review as allowing students to practice their feedback giving, and we're interested in how that kind of plays out in terms of their overall success in the course. You can understand that as the course grade. And we're interested in how that can be understood in terms of student identity markers. So we have done some large-scale research with some pilot sections here. And what we found is that the total word count, so if we're looking at these contextual comments, final comments, at least for our program, can be understood as a predictor variable for 14% of our students in terms of their final grade. So that's a significant proportion. We look at this as a low stakes, though, writing task, right? So it's not something that carries a lot of weight for our final grade. It's something that we're asking students to do, to practice, to directly contribute to those final writing projects that do have a lot of the weight. This particular task, we gave, and I'll toggle back to the writing task real quick. We said minimum about 650 words. Some students meet that, some students don't meet that, but what you do need to understand is that the range of the feedback that they were giving between about 250 words to about 500 words. So they were almost writing as much in review as they were writing for the initial draft. And that, again, is fortifying that notion of practice, giving the students practice. And we found some interesting things, especially with the lower groups of students that come in initially that don't write as much in practice. We're experimenting, kind of trying some different interventions, how to get those students to practice more, especially if it is connected to their writing success and their final course grade.
Great. Thank you for sharing, Brian. So let's open the floor for questions. You
I'll
can,
stop the share, okay? So that.
excellent. We're back to the panel view. You can use the chat to ask your questions, or you can unmute and ask. So what would you like to ask these two programs about Eli and their courses?
Hi, thank you very much to the panelists for this. This is really interesting. I have a totally unformed question, so this is probably gonna be rambling. I apologize in advance. I typically teach face-to-face. I'm online because of current circumstances, and have been using Eli Review since the spring. I like doing peer review actually in class, synchronously in face-to-face rooms, even though it's a heavy drain on time. Because while it's low stakes in terms of the assessment, I do want accountability, and I want accountability kind of in terms of labor. And so I feel like if I'm in the room with the students, I can see that they're hunched over that paper and they're writing, and I'm walking around and I'm reading comments, and I'm starting to pick up trends by reading over people's shoulders, and I can stop the whole class and say, hey, by the way, you should do this, or you should look for this. So Eli Review, which I'm loving so far, I have, by the way, I have like 110 students this semester. And so I'm getting lots, there's a lot here. Melissa even sent me an email earlier in the semester to say that I had a lot of human beings I was dealing with here. And so what I find is I want that accountability, even though it is low stakes, I want that accountability. And I would like to use this more frequently than I am. But I feel compelled to check to make sure that some good review is happening. But man, it's just an overwhelming, I can look at the table of data and kind of look at those. And so I guess what I'm asking is, do you do that? Do you assess at all how much labor they're putting into their reviews? And do you do it kind of just through the quantitative data? Do you scroll through the whole list of qualitatives and kind of just spot check those and say, okay, this is looking good, and maybe you stop and read a few here and there? Or what I do have trouble with is trying to get really deep into it, because of the way that you get that, you can't really see it contextually without clicking a million times, right? Like if you have 110 students, that's logistically difficult. So how do you kind of assess and impose some accountability on the reviewers, especially if you have a lot of students? And I hope that question makes some kind of sense.
Go ahead, Catrina.
Go ahead, Brian.
Well, you go for it.
So in teaching these classes, so there's a rubric for all of the peer reviews. So they have to have done, so many contextual reviews. And in the beginning, because we have, I think there's at least 3 review cycles where they're submitting, reviewing, doing a revision plan. In the very beginning, I spend the most time, so that I can, I still give them credit for having done it, but that's where I say, when you were giving feedback on this, you could have done this, or answered this question, or if you thought it was great, then explain why it was great, and what other things could have been done to make it better. So I do spend more time on that in the beginning, and then they sort of start to get it. But when I'm looking for those things, I will do the comment view and then sort by user. And then I don't necessarily read all the way through them. I just eyeball, often for length. And if they look particularly short, then those I know are the students where I'm going to need to spend more time reading them, because they're having a hard time giving a good review. So more time in the beginning, and then I have to do that less as time goes on. And that's been the best way for me to sort of manage the higher student. I think 75 has been my highest at one time. But yeah.
To add, we kind of take a little different approach at Western in our first year writing program. So we view it as kind of low stakes practice. And in that sense, we do, at a baseline, we are checking for completion. But with that kind of philosophy kind of foregrounded, we do front load a lot of, you know, and Eli Review, you know, makes this very clear. Kind of Eli Review, describe, evaluate, suggest pedagogy, right, up front. We've got a portion of our textbook that kind of profiles the benefits for students in terms of our programmatic language. We also walk through a lot of, you know, some of the things that Catrina was just talking about in class. But beyond that, we have a meeting right around week 4, week 5, when we're 4 to 5 weeks in, and you can kind of think of it like a writing conference, but it does very different things. One of the things that we utilize is the information graphic under the course analytics. And so we actually sit down with each student a couple of minutes, and we say, here's where you're performing. Here's where some of your peers are performing, you know, 30% up on the top and 30%, you know, towards the bottom. And then we dig into the quality of their comments. So we pull up that quality, the comment digest, and we look at maybe some of the successful reviews that they had, maybe some of the less successful ones. We talk about that, and we set strategies with them for improving upon that. So it is kind of individualized. You know, it starts with quantity, moves to quality, and then look into the future. And so we do that twice, and we have seen really good results with that. That's a motivator. The bottom, one of the things that Eli Review will do for you is they can give you the quartiles of students. What we found is that the bottom quartile of students after that meeting, so these are the students that have written the least early on in the course, will actually leapfrog the top 2 quartiles after that meeting. And so that's as a whole, right? I'm speaking generalities, but that's how we use it. So we do just grade for completion.
And I will just,
very, very interesting. Thank you both.
so I like John's question a lot because it talks about micromanagement, right? The tendency to be responsible for everything as an instructor. And I will just plug this one more time, right? When you're walking around a workshop that's happening in real time and space, you don't hold yourself accountable for every word that's exchanged. Eli is a panopticon. It captures every word that's exchanged, but you don't have to necessarily embrace the responsibility to read it all, observe it all. It happened whether you were there or not, just like in a face-to-face classroom. So it's very difficult to sort of to draw that line for yourself, but it's an important issue for everybody to think about.
That in fact is one of the ways that we try to sell it to students. You know, selling that we value what you have to contribute. So when we have the little blurb in our syllabus template, it includes some of that language, that, you know, this is about you all reviewing each other. And we don't get to jump in until after you figure out what you want to do with all of that feedback you got.
We have time for at least one more question. Anybody?
I certainly don't want to monopolize, but if there are no other questions, I do have one more, but I'm welcome to wait a minute more if somebody wants to speak up.
Go for it, John.
I was just curious if you had any strategies to share about priming students when they rate their reviewers' comments, because they confound me. I see people rating things very low that are excellent comments, in my opinion, and vice versa. And I haven't put a lot of thought into it, but I was like, there's got to be something I can do to frame this for them where they are better at rating the kinds of feedback they're getting. Because when I look at the rankings, they actually are kind of meaningless to me, because they're doing such a poor job, in my opinion, of rating their peers' feedback on their stuff. And I just don't know if they're just getting the stars backwards sometimes, or what. I don't know. So I don't know if you have any strategies or any way that you frame that, but I would love to know.
So we don't rely upon the star rankings too much. We do have classes that do embrace it. So I couldn't necessarily speak to that, but I'll pick up on a comment that you made, and that's the meaning making. I think Eli Review has a lot of ways that you can contextualize it and use it for your own purposes, right? So, you know, if you want to really focus in on those star comments, you can make that a part of your pedagogy, and you can focus the meaning making that students are kind of, you know, engaged with, and you can say, this is kind of our focal point, and the context there, I think, would go a long way. But I see that as kind of what I think, at least our program, the one at University of Arizona, is doing. We're finding kind of the places where we want to focus our attention to make meaning, to really, you know, pinpoint, hey, this is the point in our curriculum that we're going to emphasize.
We have struggled a little bit with the ratings in the past, but I will say that I think one of my favorite ways of framing the ratings is actually Melissa's. You know, sort of the stars don't have to be quality, right? So the stars can be related to what's included, and you know, 1 or 2 stars can be the describe, and 3 stars can be the evaluate, and 4 stars can be the suggest. So, you know, using the star system to create a framework for the feedback that you received is also something useful, and something we've been sort of chewing on moving forward, because it's tough. And you know, sometimes students are like, well, my review was only rated with 1 star, and they take that very personally. So I think, you know, taking it and framing it in a way that is about helping students improve their reviews, as opposed to this was terrible. Thanks, Melissa, for dropping that in there. I knew you had it somewhere. But I think, you know, that that is really, I think it was back in August, Melissa came in and sort of did a presentation for our instructors, and that was something that really they grabbed onto, because that star rating can sort of be problematic if you take it as, you know, value laden.
Yeah. And so I'll just summarize this, and then we'll close the recording. Helpfulness ratings are a way for writers to have agency, right? It lets them say, I'm not getting what I need from peer review, or I am getting what I need from peer review. If you tie it to a grade, you've ruined helpfulness ratings. And so you have to say to students what you want each star to mean, but you cannot say it means a grade, right? This means I need help, or I got what I needed. And so the way I explain it, and the link that I included there, is every part of a comment gets a star. So if there's a description that helps you understand your writing, straight up Peter Elbow, paraphrase and say back, that's 1 star. If there's an evaluation of how well you met one of the criteria covered in the review, that's a 2nd star. If it offers you a suggestion you can use, and yes, praise can have a suggestion, that is a 3-star comment, and most comments should be 3 stars. If the comment goes beyond to be respectful of you or of your work, that is a 4th star comment. So the 4th star is for kindness in my rubric. And the 5th star is reserved for transformative comments, comments that change more than 1 word and more than 1 sentence and more than 1 paragraph. If it doesn't change in a ripple effect, it's not transformative. So that helps students recognize 3 stars as fine, as desirable, as good, right? Exactly what we're looking for. And then for 4 and 5 stars to be more rare. So thank you for a good conversation. I'm